Well, hello again, everyone out there in the technological ether. It is I, Donovan Marley, Senior Paramedic and Paramedic Shift Trainer with King County Medic One, coming to you from the South King County Fire Training Consortium, where we're filming a run review video for Q2. Now, this video is going to focus on cardiac arrest cases. We're going to talk about a few things here. We're going to talk about the anatomy of a cardiac arrest, ALS and BLS, what was done well on the BLS side, using the EMS guidebook, or EMT guidebook rather, as well as talk a little bit about the FACT trial. On the ALS side, we're going to talk about why the medics did what they did with these different patient presentations, and we'll talk about a little anatomy and physiology. So first slide here, we're going to talk about anatomy of cardiac arrest. This is a quick breakdown. I'm not going to go over everything here. As always, feel free to pause the video on any of these slides where there's too much information for me to get through, and you can always run through and make sure that we're on the same page. But ultimately, BLS, your job with a cardiac arrest is recognizing the existence of a cardiac arrest, right? Scene safety, is this patient truly pulseless and apneic, and then go from there. Initial oxygenation, reperfusion, and ultimately conversion is possible on the BLS side of things. As far as the ALS side is concerned, we're going to focus on reversing the H's and T's. That's mainly hypoxia, arrhythmia, fluids, and electrolyte imbalance. I have listed them all here. Feel free to pause it and look over all of them at your discretion. Again, from the previous video, you remember me talking about if it wasn't written, it wasn't done. Again, when you're writing a narrative, you aren't just telling a story, you're painting a picture. And obviously, this is my face on that of Bob Ross, so you're welcome for that. Just remember that when you're writing your narrative. If I'm reading it, put me in the room with you. That's really all it takes. I want to focus first on the post-mortem stages of death. Now, it is a BLS skill to be able to identify that this patient is DOA as opposed to being an actual patient who can be resuscitated or is otherwise resuscitatable, if that's a word. So let's talk about the 4 post-mortem stages of death. The first stage is pallor mortis. That's about 30 minutes after death, and kind of like it says, pallor, the patient is pale, pretty self-explanatory. The second stage is algor mortis. Now this is anywhere from 18 to 20 hours, and this is where the body temp actually begins to drop. It takes that long for a body temp in an otherwise normotemp environment to actually begin to lose body heat. A lot of times we'll get on scene and we'll say, oh, the patient is still warm. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have a high level of resuscitatability, right? So just keep that in mind. The third stage is rigor mortis. Now, what we know as rigor, initially when the body processes die, the body goes flaccid. It takes anywhere from 1 to 2 hours for the body to really start to exhibit rigor, which is that stiffness in the body where maybe the joints don't move or the jaw is stuck tight, and that's called trismus, when the jaw is really locked shut. That starts anywhere from 2 hours to 12 hours, but that's one of the factors that we see in the field as far as identifying if this is a DOA, right? The next one, the fourth stage, is livor mortis. Now this is also known as lividity. This is where when the body is laying flat, the blood will actually settle and pool in the lowest points, right? Now that usually takes anywhere from 6 to 8 hours. Now all of these factors can give or take, they can overlap a little bit. Ultimately, if you feel unsure, perform CPR and the medics can figure it out when they get there. And I've also put the website at the bottom as a resource if you want to learn a little bit more. Now here's page 72 of the EMS Blue Book. Now here it says, resuscitative efforts may be withheld or stopped in any of the following. The second bullet point there is lividity or rigor mortis. So feel confident that if you see any of those things in a patient that you've arrived on, you can cancel all incoming. This patient is DOA, an established time of death. Let's talk about our first patient here. We've got a 55-year-old male who presents in cardiac arrest. The patient was found unconscious, unresponsive on the bathroom floor by the boyfriend who called 911. Now, this patient was last seen yesterday morning at 11 o'clock. No CPR performed prior to arrival of EMS. Engine 375 arrived and moved the patient from the bathroom into the bedroom. I really, really love that they moved the patient. They knew there wasn't enough room to work if this was a true cardiac arrest in the bathroom. Let's get this patient out to where we have a lot more room to work. Initial analysis, no shock advised. They did 1 round of CPR, but when they attempted airway access, they found rigor in the jaw. Again, when the jaw is locked shut, that's called trismus. If we can't open the jaw, we can't establish an airway, and pretty much everything we're doing after that is moot. So if you have rigor in the airway and rigor in the extremities, like they've stated here, we're done. That patient is DOA, cancel all incoming, establish time of death, and we're finished. But due to last known well of over 24 hours in presence of rigor, resuscitation efforts were ceased. That was really good documentation on their part. Here's a few takeaways here. I think those are fairly self-explanatory. Feel free to pause the presentation as needed. Let's talk a little bit about the FACT trial. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this slide, but this is pages 126, 127, and 128 of the EMS Blue Book. It talks about the first responder airway and compression rate trial. This is where you're focusing on either a two-handed, two-person bag valve mask technique, establishing an I-gel airway, and then what your compression rate will be for your cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Now this patient is going to be a 76-year-old male who's in cardiac arrest, and you can see here that this crew utilized the I-gel. Really good job documenting not just the time, but also that the patient had vomited and that it was removed by paramedics. That's really good documentation here. As far as their narratives is concerned, AID 313, Engine 377, and Medic 7 were called to the home of a 76-year-old female who was unconscious, unresponsive. Now, the husband saw her 15 minutes prior to this incident happening, so that's a fresh patient, that's someone we can resuscitate, and we should do the best we can to give them the best possible outcome. The patient was in the bedroom. She was warm, no obvious signs of death. Really good documentation. That's those four post-mortem signs or stages of death, rather. The officer did a really good job of documenting that on arrival to the scene, the patient was seated in her bedroom, she was warm, and had no obvious signs of death. That's really good documentation. That's going back to those 4 stages of death and being able to identify the length of time that this patient's heart has actually stopped beating. They were unable to find a pulse, got her out of that room and into the living room when there was more room to work. Again, excellent job. Now, they note here that emesis is coming out of the patient's mouth. They did a really good job suctioning and securing that airway with an I-gel. They confirmed that I-gel with good chest rise and fall. Again, really solid documentation here. When you establish an I-gel saying good chest rise and fall, good exchange of oxygen, good ventilation, all those sorts of key comments to make during your narrative are really important. Ultimately, the chaplain was called. They couldn't resuscitate this patient, but every opportunity was provided to her to recover, so good job. Here's some takeaways from that patient as well. Again, I'm not going to focus too long on this page. Feel free to pause it here, but they stuck to the FACT trial really well as had some really good documentation here. So here we've got a 100-year-old female in cardiac arrest. This was actually a patient that I had just yesterday, and I feel like there's some value in you seeing what an ALS documentation looks like. So this is my write-up. This is my SOAP report. This is just one example of an ALS narrative, but hopefully it can give you some guidance to kind of show you what we hope to see in a good documentation. So here you can see we've downloaded our life pack, so we've got all the accessible vitals that we had, airway access, and establishing oral tracheal intubation. We've got a list of all our treatments here. You can see epi, IV access, sodium bicarbonate. We did have one defibrillation in there. She had one episode of ventricular fibrillation, but otherwise was just asystole. Now this was actually a witnessed arrest by Engine 373 who beat us to the scene by quite a few minutes. It was hard for us to find the address because it was down a pretty long driveway that was poorly identified, but they did an excellent job, first and foremost, identifying the cardiac arrest. They got an I-gel secured and confirmed good ventilations with chest rise and fall. I really appreciate that because they told us that when we got there. We've got good chest rise and fall with the I-gel. Awesome. Now, here's an ALS narrative, right? Feel free to pause it here. I'm not going to go through this entire thing verbatim, but this is how I write most of my narratives, not just on cardiac arrests, but you'll see that I actually isolate S, O, A, P, subjective, objective, assessment, and plan. Take the time to write down all the details, right? Put the reader in the room with you. If you run into a hiccup or a speed bump, feel free to document it, what happened, why it happened, what information was given to you upon your arrival, right? What you see and did. All of these things help write a well-rounded narrative. And kind of like before, if you remember my face on Bob Ross, if it wasn't written, it wasn't done. paint a picture, tell a story, and make sure that the reader really knows what you're doing. This next slide here is the types of arrest and medications and procedures that may be performed on the ALS side of things. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here. Feel free to pause this slide and look over a lot of the things that we will try and aim for in either ventricular fibrillation or pulseless VTAC or in asystole PEA cardiac arrest. Otherwise, I hope you learned a little something about cardiac arrests today. Take the time to read through some of these slides. I know I'm going through pretty quickly because we want to try and keep these condensed into about 10 or 11 minutes, but there's a lot of good information here. I hope you learned something. As always, please reach out to a paramedic shift trainer if you have any questions, or just your everyday field medic. We love talking about this stuff and we love answering your questions. Other than that, thanks for listening. We'll see you out there.